What if I told you that one of the reasons for the discovery of America under Christopher Columbus, and one of the reasons for why it was the British were finding new ways to get to Asia, was to avoid the Islamic Middle East and get away from the Islamic conquest and find allies to help them defeat Islam during these centuries of Islamic conquest and occupation and slaughtering of people in the Christian world. In other words, I'm about to explain to you why America was discovered and founded as a result and a reaction to Islamic imperialism. Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all doing well. In today's episode, we're going to be diving into the topic of colonialism and specifically what it was that was driving much of the West's discovery of the New World and why it was that it was putting all this energy into finding ways to circumnavigate entire continents to do trade. See, one of the fascinating things about modern people is that we all have terrible amnesia, and as a result of this, we start believing really absurd things about the world and reality. And one of these absurd beliefs is that when it comes to Islam, when it comes to Islamic Jihad, when it comes to Islamic terrorism, and all the violence that pours out of the Islamic world, that all of this is just a modern phenomena, that all the Islamic violence is actually a response and a reaction to Western imperialism. In other words, it was only after America went into Iraq and Afghanistan and was bombing places and civilians were dying that it was the relatives of those people who were killed that became radicalized by this, and in order to avenge the deaths of their relatives, became Islamic terrorists and then unleashed their destruction on the rest of the world. And prior to the Western imperialism, the Islamic world was this peaceful, harmonious place. This, my friends, is a fantasy, and in fact, as we're about to get into in this episode, much of the cause and driving factors behind the British Empire and the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus was actually in response and a reaction to Islamic imperialism. So let's watch a video from Raymond Ibrahim and we'll get back into it in a second.
Although the fake history we were all taught in school claims Columbus and other Europeans sailed west for spices or to prove the world was round, the reality is that they all did so first and foremost to circumnavigate and fight Muslims. When Columbus was born, the then more than 800-year-old war with Islam, or rather defense against Jihad, was at an all-time high. In 1453, when Columbus was but 2 years old, the Turks finally sacked Constantinople, an atrocity-laden event that rocked Christendom to its core. Over the following years, Muslims continued making inroads deep into the Balkans, leaving much death and destruction in their wake, with millions of Slavs enslaved. Yes, the two words, Slavs and slaves, are etymologically connected for this very reason. In 1480, when Columbus was 29, the Turks even managed to invade his native Italy. In the city of Otranto, they ritually beheaded 800 Italians and sawed the local archbishop in half for refusing to recant Christianity and embrace Islam. Their skulls are still housed and visible to see at the Cathedral of Otranto. It was in this backdrop that Spain's monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, themselves avowed crusaders, especially the Queen, who concluded the centuries-long Reconquista of Spain by liberating Granada from Islam in 1492, took Columbus into their service. They funded his ambitious voyage in an effort to launch, in the words of historian Louis Bertrand, quote, a final and definite crusade against Islam by way of the Indies, which culminated, of course, in the incidental founding of the New World. Many Europeans were convinced that if they could only reach the peoples east of Islam, who, if not Christian, were at least not as yet infected by the Mohammedan plague, to quote Nicholas V, who was Pope during Columbus's youth, together they could crush Islam between them. The plan was centuries old and connected to the legend of Prester John, a supposedly great Christian monarch reigning in the East who would one day march westward and avenge Christendom by destroying Islam. All this comes out in Columbus's own letters. In one, he refers to Ferdinand and Isabella as, quote, enemies of the wretched sect of Muhammad. In another written to the monarchical couple after he reached the New World, Columbus mentions trying to raise an army for, quote, the war and conquest of Jerusalem, unquote. That his voyage is centered on liberating Jerusalem from Islam is further evident in the title of one 2011 book, Columbus and the Quest for Jerusalem. Nor were Spain and Columbus the first to implement this strategy. Once Portugal was cleared of Islam as early as 1249, its military orders launched into Muslim Africa. According to historian George Grant, the great and overriding motivation behind Prince Henry the Navigator's explosive energy and expansive intellect was the simple desire to take the cross, to carry the crusading sword over to Africa, and thus to open a new chapter in Christendom's holy war against Islam. Prince Henry launched all those discovery voyages because he, quote, sought to know if there were in those parts any Christian princes who would aid him against the enemies of the faith, wrote a contemporary. By the way, do all these inconvenient facts behind the founding of the New World make Columbus, Ferdinand, Isabella, Prince Henry, indeed the whole of Christendom, Islamophobes, as those few modern-day critics who bother mentioning the true motivation of Columbus's voyage allege? For example, in an LA Times op-ed, Yale historian Alan Mikhail wrote, quote, a primary force behind Columbus's Atlantic crossings was a fear and hatred of Islam. This shaped how white Europeans engaged with the New World and its native peoples for centuries, and how today's Americans understand the world. Columbus was born into Europe's anti-Islamic mindset in 1451. While much of this is true, Mikhail does not bother explaining why there was such a fear and hatred of Islam, or why Europe had an anti-Islamic mindset in the first place. Rather, white Europeans were just unenlightened bigots, racists in contemporary of infinitely overdone parlance. But therein lay the irony. Yes, Columbus and Europeans were Islamophobes, but not in the way that word is used today. While the Greek word phobos has always meant fear, its usage today implies irrational fear. However, considering that for nearly 1,000 years before Columbus, Islam had repeatedly attacked Christendom to the point of swallowing up 3/4 of its original territory, including for centuries Spain, that Islam's latest iteration in the guise of the Ottoman Turks was during Columbus's lifetime, devastating the Balkans and Mediterranean, slaughtering and enslaving any European who dared travel east through their domains. And considering that even centuries after Columbus, Islam was still terrorizing the West, marching into Vienna with 200,000 jihadists in 1683, and even provoking America into its first war as a nation around the year 1800. The very suggestion that Western fears of Islam were or are irrational is itself the height of irrationalism.
So there we go, a fascinating glimpse into history. And look, neither Raymond nor myself are implying that this is the only factor for Columbus's voyage. Of course not. Life is complicated and there are multiple forces. But you have to remember that this, conveniently, seems to be the only detail that we don't hear about when it comes to Columbus. And a lot of this has to do with what I said at the beginning. We all have terrible amnesia. And one of the things that I think is causing this naivety towards Islam in the West is that the wars that were fought to push back Islam in Europe, that was coming for Europe, and all the bloodshed of the ancestors of modern Europeans that was spilt to pave the way for freer societies that were not under the yoke of Islamism and terrorism. And just imagine what you see today in Afghanistan and Iran and other countries like that would have been what we'd be seeing in France and the UK and Spain and Germany if it wasn't for these crusades pushing them back. And this wasn't an instant reaction. A lot of the Christian world was occupied by the Islamic forces for centuries before they were able to organize themselves and push back. But basically, this forgetfulness of what's been happening and what the true reality of Islam is when it enters a society and how it enforces itself in the political systems and the bloodshed, the forgetfulness of this, combined with this absurd belief that actually Islamic terrorism is just a modern reaction to Western imperialism, and that if we want to get rid of terrorism, the West just needs to be less strong, less imperial, less conquering, less strong in its beliefs and its identities, and that's how we create a peaceful world. That we are seeing this rise of Islam in Europe and in the West. And we're going to be watching another video in just a second, because part of this narrative about the West is that we are these evil, conquering, colonial, slave trading white people, and we deserve what's coming to us. But we're now going to dive into another fascinating element to this, which relates to slavery. And before I get into this, just very quickly, when it comes to the British Empire, a lot of the reason for the British building their navy ships in such a way that they were able to circumnavigate the world and the East India Trading Company, all the rest of it, was that as the British Empire was sort of forming itself, it was entering into a world where Islamic rule was dominant. That was the dominant colonial force in the world. It was the Ottomans. And basically, in order to do trade over land, there were incredible amounts of tariffs put on trade by the Muslims. So you got high tariffs, you got violence. It's unsafe for the infidels to go into those lands, and it's just unstable, volatile prices. And so, in order to get around this, rather than doing trade over land, they decided to go via sea. And so they were having to circumnavigate entire countries to do trade and avoid the Islamic Middle East. So, in other words, British expansion and discovery and the East India Trading Company, a lot of this stuff was taking place in the context of a world gripped by a dominant Islamic force and was a response to, therefore, Islamic imperialism. But this relates to America's founding as well. So let's watch this clip here by Christopher Hitchens. Let's watch it.
In 1788, when the United States was barely a country,
right,
it was having its sailors taken as slaves by the Barbary states, the states of the Ottoman Empire in North Africa.
Tripoli.
Tripoli,
Shores of Tripoli.
Shores of Tripoli. And its people, its ships stopped, its crews carried off into slavery. We estimate 1.5 million European and American slaves taken between 1750 and 1815. Jefferson and Adams went to their ambassador in London and said, why do you do this to us? The United States has never had a quarrel with the Muslim world of any kind. We weren't in the Crusades. We weren't in the war in Spain. Why do you do this to our people and our ships? Why do you plunder and enslave our people? And the ambassador said very plainly, Mr. Abdul Rahman said, because the Quran gives us permission to do so, because you are infidels. And that's our answer. And Jefferson said, well, in that case, I will send a navy which will crush your state, which he did, and a good thing, too. Islamic fundamentalism is not created by American democracy. It's a lie to say so. It's a masochistic lie, and it excuses those who are the real criminals, and it blames us for the attacks made upon us. Don't have anything to do with this man. Raids as far north as the town of Baltimore in Ireland, the whole of whose population was carried off in one night into slavery by Muslim slavers in the late 17th century, and many towns in Devon and Cornwall. As far north as Iceland, this trade, shameful trade, went on. And it started to attack the United States as well as soon as it became independent. And at this point, Mr. Jefferson decided that that means war. The existence of this policy is incompatible with the existence of the United States. A navy will be built, a Marine Corps will be founded, we will send a fleet, we will put down this trade. And we will not just put down the slave trade, but we will force a passage through Gibraltar, allowing free trade for every other country between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. That is the birth of America as a superpower. The very thing that every liberal considers to be the most degraded kind of imperialism now. The very triumph, in other words, of Enlightenment ideas and free trade ideas in combination.
There we go, the ever-eloquent Christopher Hitchens. Now, one of the tragic parts of all of this is the naivety to this history. And look, this should be mainstream things that are taught in schools, but are just not. In fact, Western kids are taught to hate their own history and to hate their own civilization. And it's taught that it's uniquely evil. And what we're seeing now is that this naivety, paired with the lack of the kind of Christian faith in the Western world, which is changing now, but it's been lacking for so long, has meant that we now believe that what is a virtue is just this blind openness and tolerance to everything. I can't tell you why that's a virtue, because if you live in a meaningless atheist universe, there is no objective good and bad. And so to assert that something is an objective good, such as tolerance, makes no sense in an atheistic paradigm. But this is basically leading to all kinds of things, such as the mass migration of Islamic people into the West, particularly the UK, the rapid construction of a lot of mosques in those countries, even in New York now, but it's also all over the UK. The Islamic call to prayer is everywhere, and you can't say anything about it, because if you do, you'll get arrested, and they're starting to bring in those laws in Australia as well. Now, another little history lesson is that when the Ottomans and the Islamic kind of conquest was taking over Constantinople and the sort of the Eastern, the Byzantine Empire, the Orthodox Christian parts of the world, that Christians, and even today in the Middle East, not allowed to build new churches. And what they were doing at this point during the Ottoman Empire is that you couldn't build new churches and you couldn't ring those bells because it was, bothering the Muslims. Now, what have we seen except for that happening in reverse in the West, where we're seeing the rapid building of mosques and this now ever-growing amount of Islamic calls to prayer over Christian lands? Now, you have to remember that the Islamic call to prayer is essentially a polemic against Christianity. It asserts that God is one and doesn't beget, and he has no son, and all this kind of weird anti-Trinitarian language in these prayers are blasted out over Christian lands, right? We believe in the Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and these are Christian lands where people have died to protect. Christian saints and martyrs have died to protect, and now we're just allowing the wholesale construction of these mosques. And honestly, the Christian crusaders and martyrs and all the people who were persecuted and victimized, and the millions of European slaves who were part of the Islamic conquest, are rolling in their graves. Now, there is a final video from Christopher Hitchens here that I'm going to play, which is a warning to the West, and this was filmed many years ago. But we've seen that his warning and his prediction has come true, and it's very high time that we need to start paying attention to this. So let's play it.
This is very urgent business, ladies and gentlemen, I beseech you. Resist it while you still can, and before the right to complain is taken away from you, which will be the next thing. You will be told you can't complain because you're Islamophobic. The term is already being introduced into the culture, as if it was an accusation of race hatred, for example, or bigotry, whereas it's only the objection to the preachings of a very extreme and absolutist religion. Watch out for these symptoms. They are just symptoms of surrender, very often ecumenically offered to you by men of God in other robes, Christian and Jewish and smarmy ecumenical. These are the ones who will hold open the gates for the barbarians. The barbarians never take a city till someone holds the gates open for them. And it's your own preachers who will do it for you, and your own multicultural authorities who will do it for you. Resist it while you can.
There we have it. Now look, there is a lot of nuance to these discussions, and I want to put that disclaimer out there. In order to fully understand these subjects, you need to read several books at least. And I'm not trying to whitewash the West. I'm not trying to whitewash Christianity and say everything the Christians did was good and everything the Islamic world did was bad. That's not the lens I'm coming at here, but we do need to take a sober look at what's happening today in the historical context. And if we don't, we are in for a very, very rough ride ahead. And we could see this same kind of rhyming history take place in Europe and the Western world, which is happening. Now, just a very quick story and an anecdote before I finish up, which is maybe of interest to you all. In my early childhood, I was born in England, and then we moved to Iran, and I lived in the capital of Iran for my formative experience and years. My first day of school, I was made to chant "Death to America, Death to England." The TV shows I would watch, the cartoons, in between the ad breaks, there would be, Islamic propaganda, men firing AK-47s, there are Hezbollah flags waving. It was a very pro-terror, anti-Western, very oppressive occupation of the great people of Iran, the great country of Iran, by this Islamic force that took over the country. And then we moved back to England, and I saw the difference in culture. This was in the early 2000s. This is pre-woke. This is pre-mass Islamization of the UK, pre-grooming gangs, I believe. The borders were a lot stronger. This is kind of pre-Tony Blair, or Tony Blair had just started to come in. And I was brought up in a sort of like a regular Church of England school, kind of everywhere in the UK. And it was just night and day. And it was just far better in the UK. However, fast forward 20-something years, and I'm facing the very real prospect right now as Iran is erupting in protests, as the people of Iran are trying to get rid of this Islamist regime in Iran, that I could see a future where Iran is less Islamic than the UK, the country I've considered home, I grew up in, that is most in my blood and way of thinking. And so this is a problem. This is a very real problem. And it's tragic when you understand the historical context of Islam and what it does. And there are other voices like me who are mixed heritage or who have come from the Middle East and are in the West and love the West and are warning people about what's coming. And you want to shake the Europeans and you want to shake those people up and go, like, wake up, open your eyes, like, look what's coming, like, listen to my words. I've come from a place that's further down the road than what's coming to you. And you want to warn them and do everything you can to warn them. That's part of what I'm doing on this channel, with love and with compassion. And I'm not trying to spread hate, but to try to share what's the reality of what's coming to the West and what's coming to Europe, and to implore people to embrace Christ, embrace Christianity. And, this isn't primarily for civilizational forces, but it's something that I just happen to talk about on this show, is the civilization changing aspects of faith. And so if you want to see this Islamic conquest and infiltration of these Muslim Brotherhood ideologies of Islamism seep further into the West at rapid speed and turn the great Western democracies into something that resembles a kind of Sharia-run kind of country, a kind of caliphate-like Islamic system, then silence voices like mine and others. That's how you achieve the Islamic spread faster, is silencing voices like my own and someone like Yasmin Mohammed or many other Christians from the Middle East or whoever else, they might not necessarily be Christians, but are warning against this. Silencing our voices makes this happen faster. And right now, laws are being passed all around the Western world that are going to be making it harder for people like myself to open my mouth and speak online about this. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video. God bless.